Hi, I'm Noam Wasserman, Dean of the SciSim School of Business at Yeshiva University. I was a longtime professor at Harvard Business School, an entrepreneur, and a venture capitalist. I wrote the bestseller, The Founder's Dilemmas.
And I'm Charlie Harary. I've been working with companies for over 10 years. And that book, The Founder's Dilemmas, and the challenges faced by the 10,000 founders in it is the basis of this podcast. We are delving into the issues faced by startups to help you avoid the pitfalls that claim so many good companies.
Let's get started.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Charlie Harary.
And I'm Noam Wasserman.
And it is great to be back with you again at the Founders Dilemmas podcast, where we are talking about tons of issues related to your business, founding, entrepreneurship, startup, everything really that is connected into an area that so many of us really need to know about and care so much about. Today's a special episode. Today is the Q&A, where we're going to really respond to some of the questions that we got. Remember, before we do, you can always send us questions at foundersdilemmaspodcast@gmail.com. So, Dean, it's great to see you again. And what kind of questions did we get?
So we got first, thank you to Elon and to Eliana for submitting some questions based on some of the prior episodes, some of the things that struck them and holes that they thought that we might be able to fill. First off, we're going to go back to our rewards dilemmas episode. That has to do with being able to split the ownership of the venture, being able to figure out who's going to own what. So the first question is in regard to splitting the equity. How do you put a price on the idea? How much equity should the founder who came up with the idea receive? Mm-hmm. So an interesting thing is you run into a lot of non-idea people and even some academics, and they argue that ideas are cheap, execution is the dear thing.
Yeah.
That it's the 99% perspiration and not the 1% inspiration.
I don't know. I seem to I switched my position on that. I used to think when I was younger that it's all about the idea and the right idea wins. And then as I get older and I start seeing the companies develop, I tend to have moved into the other category where ideas work many times only because they're in your head. But not every idea that's in one's head actually translates. But it's a great question. You know, what the executioner can't possibly execute without the idea person.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, we'll get into the executioner part a little bit later when we talk about founders getting fired. But
right.
To the extent that that evolution that you've gone through is an interesting one. A lot of times the people who have come up with the idea think that that is the magic, and then it runs into the head-on collision with the ones who say 99% is the perspiration that goes into it. Within my data, we can go and tap that first. We could also get into, as always, moving back and forth between actual founders and case studies and then the data. Within my data, there is actually an idea premium. Mm-hmm. There is more that the person who came up with the idea is able to get when they were looking at how much each of them is getting around the equity. The idea premium on average is about 10 to 15 percentage points. So, for instance, if one of the founders is having 45%, the other one getting 55%, 43%, 57%, et cetera. So that's Bederach law. That's in general how much that would be. However, one of the critical things is that not all ideas are the same. There's very different quote-unquote ideas. There is a world-beating idea that has never been seen before. That's what a lot of times part of the problem comes, that every idea person thinks that theirs is unique, that theirs is a very much a world-beating one. But there's also lots of Me Too ideas, and and if anything, that's what dominates the idea landscape is the incremental rather than the world-beating ones. But we can see there's a bit of a spectrum from there's the Me Too idea up to the world-beating one. There's also where the idea is identifying a need, a pain in the market, or it's identifying also the solution to it. Mm-hmm. That's also a bit of a difference in terms of the spectrum and where that's going to fall there. Another one is this a copyable idea? As soon as you have a discussion with someone else, they can take the idea and run with it. They might be better at the execution, and so now you've lost everything because they're going to be able to beat you to getting the thing in place. Or is it the type of thing that could be protected? You can file a patent on it. You can be able to have the IP, the intellectual property is going to be protected for it. And so the difference between the copyable and the protectable is another one of those things. And so within that spectrum, you're going to differ by that. You might have the kind of idea that is not worth almost any premium, just a couple of percentage points, or it might be that the idea is 20 to 25%. If it's someone who is coming out of a lab, they've already protected the IP, it is a brand new molecule that they've been able to create. Right. They are the ones who came up with both the need and the solution. solution across all of these things. And so a bit of a range, but to be able to just peg like what the typical is, it's in the 10 to 15 percentage points realm.
Right, but no two ideas are created equally is what you're saying, and that has to be it's a very specific situation as to what the idea is and where it falls.
Yeah, and it's also where you need a meeting of the minds, because the idea person might be saying, this will be protected, this is world beating, I'm the one who came up with both the need and the solution, and then the rest of the team saying, but wait, we did help you hone this idea, this wasn't all you. You really were putting the finger on the pain, but you didn't have a good solution to it, and other things like that, and so this is where the team is going to have a dialogue about it.
So let me delve into it a little bit, because I'm thinking about the different companies that I've been connected to in this specific, and they deal with this a lot. But here's how I would think they would deal with it. The idea many times comes from an ideator. And there are people that have the ability to ideate. And there are people right now as we speak that if you give them a whiteboard and a marker and lots of coffee, and you get out of their way for a week, they'd be in heaven. They'd be doing circles and changing the world. You give them to put them in front of a Monday.com board or an email list, and they're going out of their minds. Then there are other people that you put them in a room with a whiteboard. They're like, what am I doing here? And they're different types of people, and they belong together. The question becomes how they're valued. And I think that's really maybe the next level of the question, which is it's the idea person is saying, what am I going to do? What's my value here? Because this is the beginning of my idea, but if I've ever done this before, I know that in 5 minutes from now, we'll need 10 more ideas. And after we got rejected 100 times, there'll be 100 new ideas. Then the market's going to turn, and I'll need 10 more ideas. And so the ability to ideate is going to be a critical part of this business. But what's the value of that? And the person who executes says, what do I need you for? I can't have you sitting around staring into a crystal ball all day. Stuff's got to get done. So when you think about the beginnings of a business, how would you split the value of an ideator who really is poor at execution, even though he or she is trying, but sometimes it's better that they just get out of the way, and an executor who says, very frankly, and I've spoken to many of them who are wonderfully self-aware, where they say, listen, I have no idea. I don't really do that, but you give me anything and I'll make it happen. How does one see the value of those two people in the relationship?
Yeah, so the part of what you're getting into, there's a self-awareness element that we've touched on as being a central, critical thing that founders have to develop. But there's also that team-level portfolio look.
Right.
You're seeing there is this strength that this person has. Right now, that is the preponderant one that we need within the team. But that's going to wane over time, and now we need the next person who's going to pick up the baton and be able to take their strengths that are distinctly different and be able to run with it. And that's where we're getting into when we're talking about the equity split in particular, being able to take that longer-term view, not just what it is right now, but over time. How is it going to scale? How is it going to go through different stages? This is going to be another echo that we're going to have in an upcoming episode in terms of how that those changes in the demands on the CEO affect the founder and the ability to lead the venture and other things like that. The self-awareness part that often is missing, the tendency that we've talked about to try to glom onto the other people who are just like us. You're going to have two idea people trying to come together, and then they have the greatest idea and no one to run with the ball. Or vice versa, that the two execution people, they come together, they stare at the whiteboard, and 2 hours later, the whiteboard is still unwritten on. And so a bunch of these things about being able to get ourselves over the hurdle of find the complementary person, the person who's going to push back on the idea, not just pour fuel on the fire, not just be in the Talmudic terms, the Messiah lach. Not just be the one who's going to say, oh, I love this, let's run with it. The person who's going to push back and be the connecto and being able to have the way in which you're going to be able to refine it by tapping each other's strengths and the complementary differences that you have there. But that's going to be one of the tougher things, as we talked about with the splits, about being able to take that longer-term view and seeing how over time we're each going to be key pieces, but it's going to differ over time also. Yeah,
I find that the hardest part of this whole thing, I know we want to get to the next question, I find the hardest part of this whole thing is when you are one person on the extreme, you don't value the other person because you don't know the other person. So the ideator doesn't value the execution person because he's like, they're a dime a dozen. I can find anyone to do this. Because he or she doesn't know, because they only know their own head. And in their own head, they're more comfortable with ideating. And so they ascribe a higher value to that which they know. Same thing on the other side. And so what ends up happening with companies, I find, especially the young ones, is that they don't give enough equity. to the other side because they don't value it inherently. And so there's this tension from the beginning that I've got this amazing idea and I'm going to have 100 more and I'm going to take on the whole world. Why would I give up my idea to somebody else and give them 50% of my company? This is going to be worth so much. And the other side, the same thing, going like, why would I work so hard for someone who spends all day doing nothing when I could be doing something else with more value? And I think the hardest part of this, what I think is the underlying root of the question, is the ability and the inability for someone who's on the extreme to actually create a proper value to an individual that is not anywhere near that person.
Yeah, to respect the value that the other one brings to it, the different domain that you haven't experienced yourself and seen that it is a problem that you're going to have someone solve.
Yeah.
The business person who doesn't appreciate the technical contributions that the techie's going to bring to it, and saying, as you were saying, that the techies are a dime a dozen.
Yeah.
And then the techie on the other side of it, I can do the rocket science. Of course, I'd be able to step into the business role. That's not anything that's any more complicated than the technical challenges that I've overcome. And so the respect that you have to bring to both sides of the equation to be able to appreciate that. One of the other things, though, you've been teeing up the I can have 100 ideas. There's also a difference in the dynamic between a founder who thinks this is my only idea.
Right.
This is everything riding on this. If I don't pursue this, or if we don't make this happen, then I'm not going to be able to be a founder again, because this is the one chance that I'm going to have at the bat. And so there's all sorts of other dynamics that emerge from that compared to the person who says, this is just another one of the stages that I'm going to go through. I'm going to have other places that I'm going to be able to put my money in terms of being able to pursue an idea, because I think I'll be able to come up with a bunch more, and that also affects the dynamics sometimes.
Sure.
Okay, next are the questions. Again, in the equity split realm. Perhaps a 50-50 split of the equity rarely turns out well, but wouldn't it be a positive if both founders contribute the same and feel equally involved with the venture? This will lead them both to put in more effort and make the company more successful. So I'll take a first crack in terms of this one. As we talked about, a bunch of the research does suggest that there are problems with the 50-50 split. However, there are 50-50 splits that can work. The key isn't what the numeric split is, but in some ways it's even more important the process of getting to that split. And so, for instance, 80% of the equal splits in my data set barely even discussed it. They just default to the 1/n rule that we had discussed. The key thing isn't that you got to 1/n, but it is that you delve into it, that you tee up the difficult discussions, that you get into all of the ways in which you're having a discussion about our strengths, our roles, the value that each of us will be adding. And then in the end, if you go through those difficult conversations, and also about the commitment, like all the intangibles around not just the contributions on the skill side, but also the motivation, and are you in this for the long term? Are you going to be able to get through the dark days and keep yourself in this? If you go through that whole thing and still end up with, yes, we think that a 50-50 split is going to be the best thing to go, then yes, I'll put my stamp of approval on that. But it's a lot more of the people who bypass, and unfortunately, an equal split is more often a sign of carelessness or an inability to deal with the difficult issues, or discounting the importance of ownership and things like that. And so go through the process, really take it seriously, and then in the end, it's very possible that a 50-50 split might be the best way to go.
Yeah, and just a couple of things that I know we spoke about in previous episodes, and just something that happened to me personally, real life stuff. And just to underline what you're saying, which I think is 100% accurate. First thing is for sure is to have the difficult conversations people don't have. They just, like you said, they just default because it's uncomfortable to have a conversation about things that you're uncomfortable about, and money and equity is uncomfortable. I remember once in my life I had a situation in which I was involved in a deal, and I just assumed that I'd be part of the deal going forward. I connected two parties together, and in the connection assumed that I would be part of the venture. It wasn't my role, wouldn't be full-time, and everybody spoke about it as such. But I never really put anything on a piece of paper. I never wanted to have the difficult conversation. I assumed so. And I called actually my rabbi of all people, who gave it to me over the head. From a religious perspective, he said to me, you are putting somebody else. If someone isn't honest with you in business, that puts them at spiritual peril. Honesty in business is a spiritual imperative. And so what you're doing is you are not pushing for what you believe is rightfully yours in this transaction. What's going to happen, he told me, and he was right, was that don't assume anything, and now you're putting somebody else in a position where they can potentially mess you over, which is bad for them spiritually. even though it's bad for you physically. He was 100% right. When I went back and spoke to the guys, they had a totally different perspective. I'm like, what do you mean? We spoke about it as the three of us. They're like, no, I thought you were just connecting us. And I realized before the venture took off that had I not had that conversation, it would have been much, because these are friends of mine. It would have been horrible. I would have been upset. And then it was the little bit of upsetness that we had with each other could have been so much worse. And so your point, which is so important, which is have a difficult conversation. Like, I know it's hard, but like, so is running a business. You know what I'm saying? Like, welcome to life. It's hard. The other two things that we spoke earlier that I want to just delve in on this is I think that one, and we spoke about this in the example you gave a couple of episodes ago. If you're tuning in now for the first time to Founders Dilemmas podcast, go back and hear the other stuff too. You're in the Q&A episode. You want to go to the actual deep level specific content episode because Dean Wasserman is amazing and he gives you incredible stuff. You can skip my parts if you want and just go to his stuff. But trust me. The stuff that we're talking about right now is building on some of the content that we've already developed. And this is one of them, which is time. I find to me that one of the greatest problems with equity splits is time. And that one person sees it as a part-time job and one person sees it as a full-time job. And they'd be okay at a 50-50 if they were both living it. And to me, once you have clarity of time and responsibility, it allows you to get to that 50-50 easier. People don't do that. They go right to the split. And they don't think, hey, wait, this isn't your full-time gig? Right? You're not doing this full time? We had this recently, just telling you the story. So now we're at a place, for those who are tuning in, I don't know what will be life in the world of crypto, but where we are right now in the evolution of crypto is crypto's on the down. Right? Now crypto is exploding. 6 months ago, it was hotter than ever, right? Post the Super Bowl. So a friend of mine invited me into a fund that they were starting for a crypto fund. So I'm listening to the pitch, and the guy's talking about it, and I asked him one question. I said, is anyone here on the fund that you're talking about going to do it full time? He goes, what do you mean? I'm like, everyone you mentioned is such impressive CVs, but it sounds like they have full-time jobs. And he goes, well, no, not really. No one's actually going to do it full time. I wait, no one's going to do it full time? He goes, yeah. I'm like, they can run a fund that full. I'm like, I'm out. He goes, no, but crypto. I'm like, yeah, it could be great, but you're not here. Nobody's full time. And I think it's such an important piece, especially when you start businesses in college or when you're doing other things, which is how so many businesses begin. You're working a full-time job and you have an idea. You're working in college, you have an idea. You're doing something to support yourself with an idea. You got to get clarity what the person's going to do, and that I think will impact your comfort later on about the split.
Yeah, and it's actually impressive that they had actually discussed it among themselves and found out that none of us is going to be full-time.
Yeah. Oh, they didn't. I asked it. No, they didn't. They were going around them.
Uh-huh.
I just happen to be in this world. I know the world of doing too many things, you know what I'm saying, and not doing them well enough. So they're pitching this, and my friend's like, yeah, I'm going to invest. And I asked the founder, the fund manager, great, who from your team, you see a deck, the back end of the deck has got super impressive resumes. And you're like, wow, you're putting together like these guys? Like, this is incredible. Like, what? This is the buy-in for this fund? Like, this fund's going to take on the world. This is the next Magellan. And I'm like, wait. It looks like all these guys have jobs. They're all leaving?
And you're going to be paying them better than what they're getting at their high-paying jobs?
No, I'm doing it on the side. I'm doing it on the side. But that's people don't realize when you start companies that is and you mentioned this is a full episode. I'm only chazering the Rebbe, you know what I'm saying? But like that when you speak about this question about the splits, it has to be tied in to the quality of the time that you put in, because that's really what I find where people start getting breigus, which is I think Yiddish for what's it Yiddish for? Upset and disappointed. Mm-hmm. Where people get disappointed in each other if you want to skip ahead a couple of months into the point where you start fighting with your founders, it comes down to how much time you spend, much less of whether or not you're more or less valuable. I find people are okay with the with the limitations of another mentally or whatever. Like they thought he was brilliant and he was just smart. Fine. What they're not okay with is, hey, I'm sitting in the office. Where are you?
Mm-hmm. No, the waning commitment over time or the surprise of is actually something that one of the movies that I show in class from startup.com. So ancient era back in the dot-com boom and stuff like that. But they are all in the fray. They're working on the business plan. They're going to be talking to an investor. And they're like, wait, where's the other co-founder? They have to go and wake him up and drag him into this meeting to do it because he had higher priorities. He had not quit his day job.
Yeah.
He had been still working for the investment bank that he was at. And so a lot of the disconnects are not just on, even if you talk about the skill side of it, it's the commitment part. It's the ways in which the nights and weekends versus the 24 hours, 24/6 that they're going to be working on together is often left on the table also.
So important. It's so important.
It's a very interesting thing that the rabbi you talked about, perspective that he had on the difficult conversations and avoiding them, that it's lifnei iver.
It's exactly what he said. That's exactly what he said.
Okay, so you're essentially putting a stumbling block in front of them.
Yeah, that's what he told me.
And the problems that you're going to cause with the temptations that they're going to face because the ways in which they're going to make decisions that are in their interest.
Yeah.
But as it turns out, if you had discussed it, you wouldn't be on the same page with them.
Yeah, and he explained to me the level of what dishonesty in business does to somebody, which is terrible. We should have a whole episode on the spiritual impact of dishonesty. I never thought of it from that perspective, where I have a religious imperative to be. This is like, I've never thought in a million years that this would be what he was telling me. Usually you expect like, whatever it is, it's okay.
I think by going to him with the question, you did think that there might be an element of it.
Maybe. But I never expected him to say that it is your religious imperative to create clarity in business because you're putting somebody else in a position where they can actually be dishonest. And dishonesty is such a big problem spiritually. I never had that perspective before, but it really does shed light on especially if you care about spirituality, it shed lights on the critical need that you must understand in having difficult conversations, which nobody wants to have, unless you want to have them. And if you want to have them, we should have another episode for you. You know what I'm saying? Like, if you're like, no, I love difficult conversations, and we should have a separate episode for those guys, because that's a whole nother story. The problems happen later on in the office. But
for that rare outlier.
right,
yes.
right. But most people don't want that.
Yeah. You're giving me, though, another appreciation for something that's been a hot topic that we're working on with NYU. Right now, we're on the verge of being able to introduce, with our new MBA program, a joint Smicha plus MBA program. And then we're going to have Rabbanim, we're going to have rabbis that are being turned out of that can relate to the business realm, can be able to see that there is the religious element that comes together with the challenging issues within the team and other things like that.
Yeah.
So it's actually one of the things I'll have to add to the list of an argument why this is something for us to pour the fuel on the fire, that you're going to get questions from a Charlie if you're a rabbi atop a shul, that you're going to have to be able to relate to the workplace problems and other things like that.
And believe it or not, this rabbi is living in Bnei Brak, who has no connection to really the outside world. But it was so clear to him.
He has rare instincts that he's able to relate to.
Yeah. And so for those who are listening, and just stay tuned. We're going to have more of these episodes that are connected to spirituality. It's not going to be this one, but just make sure that you subscribe and you're part of this podcast so that you don't miss it.